The growth of the British Empire. As it turns out, you know, this whole dynamic of what happens to the British, especially in the 18th century, is really of monumental importance because it impacts the globe, and it continues to impact the globe today. Because if you want to do business in the world today, I don't care where you're from, what you're going to do, you need to know the English language. English is, and how did that happen? It happened because of the 18th century, the incredible dynamic growth and great victories of what's called the First British Empire. It changes everything. I remember when I was in Britain the last time, and I went to used to go to my favorite little pub. Well, I had two of them. One wasn't enough. Pub called the Lamb. It's where Charles Dickens used to go and do his writing. A very famous British author at the time, 19th century British author. And I was there with a lot of people. We'd all done research at the British Museum, research at the India office, and so forth. And we would collect there at night and go there, and always have a Guinness or two, or 3 or 4. And it was a lot of fun because everybody there came from somewhere else. Nobody came from England. They came from all over the place. India, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand. Very thick accents from all over the place, United States, Canada, and so forth. But the one thing we sort of all, you know, when you're there, you realize that something's going on. We had a number of young scholars from the Middle East as well, young Arab scholars, Turks. They could all speak English. They all did. And they realized this was the one thing that how does this happen? The result of the expansion of the British Empire. And it still gives the globe, even though the empire is long gone, it still gave the globe a language of communication, global networking, and everything else. It's not Chinese, it's not Spanish, it's English. English is like it or not. A lot of people don't like it, and they refuse to speak it, but it's going to be to their detriment, because if they don't learn to speak it, they don't learn to deal with it, you can't deal in big time. You can only deal small time. You cannot rely on a smaller vernacular to really carry you through. English is still, and we use a strange term. We said it's the lingua franca. Lingua franca means the French language. Well, that's because of the century before, and before that, in the 17th, 16th, 17th century, the language of international diplomacy that everybody spoke was French. It was the language of the court of Louis XIV. Made it famous, French was famous, diplomacy was famous, and so all that was very much in place at the beginning of the 18th century. But the British changed all that. They didn't change that part deliberately, but by virtue of the conquest and winning almost all of their global wars in the 18th century, the 18th century emerges as the English century. It carries into the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. It's still with us. So just sort of keep that thing in mind. I mean, a lot of people don't like it. They don't like English, they don't like Americans, they don't like the language, you know, they want to fight it all the time. But at the same time, English is, and it's a difficult language. Most people who speak it don't really understand it, or they don't use it properly. There's no such thing as a selfie, I don't care what. My picture. Or these ones, those ones, and it's so totally ignorant, but it's all over the place, so I might as well just accept it. Okay. Now I'll get off my high horse here. Let's get on to the question of what goes on in the 18th century. Britain had won already 2 wars which they had not planned, which they had not started. But what England is desperately trying to do is maintain the balance of power on the continent by siding with anybody that will side against a major power that tries to take over the continent. England's problem is very simple. We don't have the manpower to fight a war against a major power on the continent, especially France. France has the largest population in Western Europe, 20 million. Now, I say Western Europe because you cross into Eastern Europe, you go into Tsarist Russia, Imperial Russia. Population there is minimally 50 to 60 million. We don't always have a census in terms of knowing the exact number, but we know it was big. But England has a population at the time of about 6 million. It's very small. And then you might add another 2 million from Scotland, and another reluctant 2 million from Ireland, I mean really reluctant. You've got a sense here of a country that has virtually no place being among the big powers. It is not a particularly, it's not a country of numerous, say, individuals. You don't have a lot. You don't have a lot of resources. But after Henry VIII, and after Edward, after Elizabeth, you do have a country that's now majoring in its naval power. Since it's an island, it has to depend on naval power. It begins to develop that power. After the Stuart monarchy is over with, that power becomes apparent when they have to fight Louis XIV in the first of the wars of the 18th century, and that is the War of the Spanish Succession. So I'd like you to know each of these wars distinctly from the book, The English Heritage, that goes into it. There are 5 wars that you have to deal with. War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the War of American Independence, and finally the last of those great wars that ends in the early 19th century, starts in the 18th, ends early 19th, and that is the War of the French Revolution and Napoleon. That's one war after the other, almost, you know, and each one has a different design, each one has a different outcome, each one has a different treaty aspects to it that really make it distinct and important, and thus the spread of the British Empire through these 5 wars. We looked at the War of the Spanish Succession. The treaty that ends the war successfully gave a number of small islands to the British. It gave Gibraltar to the British. It gave a small portion of French Canada to the British. And in turn, the British traded some territories back at the end of that war. It's the War of the Spanish Succession. The next war, Austrian Succession, you almost have the same alliance. It's fought between, in case you don't get the numbers, between 1740, 1748. First war was 1700 to 1714. The second war here, Austrian Succession, again, there is a fight for Gibraltar, a fight for French versus British control of the Caribbean. You have major calamities in India between the East India Company fighting in India and the French East India version of the East India Company. Ultimately, the British win the second war. they return some property. Typically, when you fight these wars, you win some, you lose some. At the end, you need to make a trade-off. You give your enemy back what you've taken from them. They give back what they've taken from you. But in each case so far, the British have won much more, and they've therefore had to give back a lot more. And come the third war, they decided, no way are we going to give this back. One of the lessons they learned in the War of the Austrian Succession, they took control of a very large French fortification in North America. Up the Hudson River Valley, near the St. Lawrence Seaway, you have this massive fortification up there, French fortification, called Louisburg, named after Louis XIV, Louisburg. Probably had at least 100 pieces of artillery up there. You had well over 2,000 guys stationed there, and at great cost, the British captured Louisburg, but most of the cost was done at the expense of American colonial fighters drafted into the British Army to fight against the French in the Second War, the War of the Austrian Succession. When it's over, as part of the deal to get everybody back on even keel, and nobody has lingering anger with the other party, the British, without consulting with their American allies, because you don't have to, what? They're colonials. We don't have to consult with them. We make the decisions. Therefore, the British made a decision to give Louisburg back to the French. And when the Americans found out about it, in almost every one of the American capitals of the 13 colonies, there was just, everybody was outraged. Especially areas which had suffered a number of casualties. Taking Louisburg was it was a 6-month frickin' slugfest. Cost several thousand American lives to do it, and the British just give it back to the French at the end of the war. Because the French will give back to the British a few islands. Yes?
Would you say that there would always be strong continuous tension between colonial English subjects and mainland England from the mainland?
It depends on whether or not you think you're actually being heard in Parliament, that the government is actually hearing you and listening to you at all. Probably the worst thing that could happen is if you get once you get the feeling that nobody is listening, that they don't give a crap about what you think. That's when the tension starts. And that is exactly what's going to lead to the American Revolution. When the Americans think, and at the same time the people of India begin to think that the British are not hearing them, any of their requests, anything, there is a huge amount of resentment that begins to spill over. And that just does not go away. What you only hope happens is somehow that discontent does not become radicalized in some way, in some movement, like a revolution. Okay, but that's exactly what happened, because the British never understand, they don't get it. And a lot of their inability to get it is the fact that their parliamentary system suggests, at least in the case of the American colonies, that they are represented in Parliament and they are heard. By whom? There's one representative for the entire 13 American colonies that sits in the British Parliament. He's their voice. He's drowned out by everybody. He's one representative. They said that's when they begin to scream later in 1775 and 76. Taxation without representation. There is no representation. You're full of crap. That's nonsense. So we're gonna come back to that. Okay. You have some of the same thing in the Caribbean islands. Some of those resentments showing up, as I said, in India. It's going to show up later in Canada when they control Canada. Okay, so now you have this lingering third war comes up. There are the issues that were fought from 40 to 48 are still somewhat unsettled. And then this war begins in the 13 colonies. It's called the 7 Years' War. It's also called the French and Indian War. But in the colonies, it's called the 9 Years' War because 2 years before it actually gets officially going, which begins in 1755. 2 years before that, in 1753, you had a survey party coming out of the colony of Virginia. Now remember, Virginia is the oldest of the 13 colonies, been there since 1607, the old Virginia Company. So it's been there a long time, been well over 150 years. And all of the 13 colonies have made claims to the American continent. If you look at the maps of early America, it's really hysterical. You look at those claims from Virginia or from Pennsylvania or from Massachusetts in the north, they cover the entire continent. Each colony claims a straight arrow of land all the way to the Pacific. If you've seen those maps, they're incredible. But they really, so Virginia is taking this serious. And they have a surveyor that works in Virginia. You know who it is. George, the boy, Washington. He's in his 30s. He takes a team of 10 guys. He leaves from western portion of Virginia, crosses into the Ohio Valley in what is today western Pennsylvania. So get the names all straight. Ohio Valley, that was the confluence of the Ohio River and other rivers, comes in near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, west of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Anybody here from Pennsylvania? Well, I remember where he went. I had a roommate in grad school when I was back there. He came from western Pennsylvania. He says, "You want to see Fort Washington?" I never heard of it. I said, "Sure." It's a little stockade in the middle of a meadow in western Pennsylvania, and that's where Washington took his survey team heading toward the Ohio River. And I saw this thing, and it's called Fort Necessity. He built it out of necessity because he was attacked immediately by the French and the Indians in the Ohio Valley. So he built it. I'm telling you, the fort's no bigger than this room. It's a little stockade, a big plaque. The plaque is bigger than the fort. It's a piece of American history. So we go, hey, three cheers. Jets fly over all kinds of stuff. You can't even find this place. Okay, so it's there. Washington is forced to surrender, disarmed, and sent back to Virginia packing in humiliation. He notifies the British Governor General of Virginia, look what's happened to me, we got screwed by the French and the Indians going into that territory. And that was the beginning of the fighting right there, because they fought, they lost, they surrendered their weapons, and they were forced back to Virginia. The British now take up the cause and see that as a cause of war. So the war breaks out. It takes a lot of negotiations to get a war justified and started. But about a year later, so in 1755, a year and a half later, you have a real war on your hands. And for the first 5 official years of this war, 55 to 59 through 59, this war is going very badly for the British, very badly. We lose on the North American continent. There's invasions by the French coming down from Louisburg, with the Americans screaming, "I told you we shouldn't have given that fort back, you assholes, but you did, and now look what's going on." So the French now control the entire St. Lawrence Seaway, upper Hudson Valley. They're moving toward New York. Let them have it, okay. But there it is. French forces come from Canada. They move down the Ohio Valley. They move down, and then they ally with the 5 nations of the Iroquois. This is a big tribal confederation covering four colonial areas. On the East Coast, the Iroquois are the most powerful tribal confederation anywhere in the East Coast. Their raids are very successful. Up and through 59, almost every battle the British fought, along with the Americans, they lost. Meanwhile, in India, the war breaks out in India again, breaks out in the Caribbean again. The British lose in the Caribbean, the British lose in India. They go into great retreat to push further south in the Indian subcontinent. Things are looking very, very bad. Change of government. New prime minister is elected in Britain in 1759. This is William Pitt the Elder. William Pitt the Elder. I want you to write that down because there is a William Pitt the Younger who shows up in the next generation, so don't get them mixed up. Father and son. Trevor.
Can you explain a little bit more about how the British East India Company controlled in India at this point?
They controlled it through an agreement with the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire had up to that point controlled most of India. The Mughals were a late-coming Muslim empire, Sunni Muslim, that came out of Persia and Afghanistan and settled in India in the early 1500s. They controlled most of the whole country by, let's say by 1650, they controlled most of it. The East India Company came into India 1619. And by agreement with the Mughal Empire, set up trade depots in northwest India at a location called Surat, S-U-R-A-T. And later they're going to acquire the city of Bombay, now today known as Mumbai, city of Bombay, through a marriage dowry. Okay. They're going to establish they're going to pay to the Mughal rulers, the Mughal emperors, roughly 15% of all of the profits they make through trade. And this trade is going to be through much of India, but also trade along the Silk Road to China, and ultimately across the Sea of Japan to Japan. It's also going to include trade with Indonesia. So there's a lot of trade coming in through the East India Company. They believed in large trade at low profit, and to make sure they paid the 15% to the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was powerful enough to just totally snuff them out. As time went on, you also had a French presence in the south, area named Pondicherry. And the French presence was also in the east coast near Calcutta. So you have this French back and forth tug of war between the French and the English East India Company. With the French, it was not so much a company presence, but a presence of a government. The French were really not very successful in setting up trading companies. Their whole ethos was against this. No French king could ever get anything going as far as the country itself forming companies and becoming capitalistic. The French were very slow at this. But the clashes in India were quite significant. What the East India Company does is use the Mughal trade lines, interior trade lines, to create interior strength for itself, build a small army, the East Company Army. They're later, it's going to later be known as the Army of Sepoys, S-E-P-O-Y-S. These are Indian troops fighting for the British Company. It doesn't exist yet, but they're beginning to get militias together from various states in India. And these states are all commonly called the Raj, R-A-J. These states would come together, support the British efforts, and support and come as allies to the English East India Company in their war with the French. War with the French will have other Indian states allied with them, so it becomes almost like a small-scale civil war.
I'm sorry, one last question. Would you say that around this time the British Empire is the most economically profitable empire at this point?
It is because they've driven the Dutch out. The Dutch were. They've driven the Dutch out by the end of the 17th century. The Dutch prices low, kept the volume high, and therefore prospered, and leased all their ships, so they didn't have to maintain upkeep and all this kind of stuff on the East India Company ships. They're not their own ships, they belong, they're privately owned by other individuals. So you don't have overhead. So the East India Company operates on the cheap, but it also grows because of that. And in time, by the time you get to roughly the 1750s, East India Company is in a very good shape, actually. The other thing is, it gives why the East India Company begins to really emerge in India, is that over time, the great Mughal Empire is beginning to disintegrate. There was an invasion in about 1730, a huge invasion by tribes from Afghanistan into northwest India, and it caused some defeat of the Mughal Empire. Mughals were never able to recover from this. And you've got to remember that India is basically a Hindu country ruled by Muslim overlords. And the Muslims never attempted to try and convert the country, but just tax it. Tax it, control it, and so forth. But not to try and enforce the religion. Hindus are they're gonna resist. I mean, you're talking about passive resistance under Gandhi, but during the period of the Mughals, if Mughals attempted to really subjugate the population, which they never did, but if they did, you would have a major civil war on their hands. And they never did try that. They just simply couldn't do it. But the Mughals leave is enormous amounts of great architecture. Their ruling city is Delhi. You've got the Taj Mahal. It's one of the greatest architectural pieces ever. And the Agra Fort, the Red Fort, and so forth. Really significant monuments that are still there. Basically, what the Mughals did was leave the Hindu communal system in place, and let them tax themselves and pay a certain amount, and don't go beyond that, just leave them alone, which they did. The only thing but they had two things that went wrong, which brought the British into power. Number one was this invasion from Afghanistan, which is going to cost them terribly. And secondly, they make war on a group, a Hindu state south of them, Hindu states confederacy called the Marathas. And the war with the Marathas is going to be a horrible, horrible war. And it's going to result in thousands being killed. The result is that weakens them again. By the time you get to 1750, the English East India Company is more or less in control of those ulterior areas, because the Mughals have sort of backed out of their position of strength. However, when the company goes to war in India, it goes to war in the name of the Mughal Empire. It raises the banner of the Mughal Empire. When it goes to, it's a very strange phenomenon that takes place in India. There's a book, it was written a long time ago about this, about the British in India at this time. And it's called History of India Part 2 by Percival Spear, S-P-E-A-R. I used to recommend it. It's still available. It's a good book, but it's still a little too Anglo-centric. You're not going to get a sense of what's going on. You're going to get a sense of what the British are doing in India, but you're not going to get a sense of what is going on among the people of India itself. And there's a newer, it's called History of India Part 2 by Percival Spear, S-P-E-A-R. And there is a very good book that just came out about India this time by Richard Eaton. Richard Eaton wrote the book on Islamic history as global history that we used last quarter in that class. Small booklet, but his book on India has gotten great reviews. So, because it really gets away from the Anglo-centricity, which we try to do in some place. But we're talking about the British Empire. You're not going to get away from Anglos. You're going to deal with it. You're going to muddle it. You're going to have fun. Okay. I mean, you learn to really hate them. Now, so they've taken over basically the interior roots of what have been the great Mughal Empire throughout all of India. But they're there in very small numbers. There's not a lot of, they don't have an official army here. They've got an unofficial army. They're going to pull one together. They're going to try to get Indian allies on their side. But nothing seems to work before 1759 on anybody. New prime minister comes to power, William Pitt the Elder. He's probably one of the best prime ministers the British ever had. The same year, well, within a year, the king dies. King of England dies. Who's the king of England? George II. Dies in 1760. So we have a new prime minister and a new king by 1760. The coming of the infamous, the one and only, George III is coming to. Now, what is George III noted for?
Insanity.
Insanity.
Overtaxing.
Overtaxing, causing the American Revolution. You name it, he did it. And he's quite a character. He comes, and he is coming with a whole new philosophy, as opposed to what has been. Everything we've talked about from the time of William and Mary up to this point, we have dealt with kings who are there to reign but not to rule. The philosophy, as stated by Parliament back in 1688, reign but not rule. Just, you're a figurehead king, will do the executive work. You just sign the papers. Okay. But now things change. You have a new prime minister who's very aggressive, and you have a new king who's very aggressive, and they're aggressive on this issue. We want to win this war. We've been taking a shellacking, so now let's emphasize what is our strength. Our strength is the Navy, and they redouble the size of the British Navy. They then decide that they need to modernize their military as well, go on the offensive. They look at the numbers of French citizenry or French subjects living in Canada, and they said there's no reason for them to be able to hold on to Canada. We can take it. Why? Because we have 3 million people in the American colonies. They only have 50,000 in French Canada. They can never encourage their people to move to Canada. They had already taken out one small piece by earlier treaty, that's Acadia, and the Cajuns wind up in Louisiana. They sail down the Mississippi, carrying the French accent with the French language, mixed with Creole, mixed with Native American, any escaped slaves, anybody, and suddenly you have a whole new language called Cajun down there. It's kind of French, it's kind of something, and nobody from France can understand a word. All right. Sounds like some of the English people speak in New Zealand. Nobody can understand a word. Regiments are now brought across. First of all, the offensive begins in the Americas. The attack is going to be tough. They got to retake Louisburg. Oh my God, here we go again with Louisburg. But we've also got to take the major French fortifications at Quebec. The French call it Quebec. And over next door at Montreal. These are both located on the St. Lawrence River. They are on this massive cliff. You've got to climb the cliffs. You've got to, what? Special forces have to be mustered immediately to defeat the French at Quebec, and that's where they start. They bring over a regiment that they had used to subjugate Scotland called the Black Watch. These were British troops, all recruited from Scotland to watch the Highlands, to keep the Highlands from going up in rebellion against them again. That they organized after 1740. These troops are now sent under General Wolfe, W-O-L-F-E, up the St. Lawrence to the cliffs just below Quebec. Quebec is a major fortress. These cliffs are about 500 feet high. They're sheer. And they're going to use ladders and grappling hooks out of boats to do this. You're going to try to land about 1,200 troops. As I say, these are special ops. We tried to do this in World War II at Omaha Beach. Anybody remember anything about that at all? Omaha Beach, we used grappling hooks shot from basically air compressed mortars. Only 13% of them actually worked because they all got wet. This is the same principle, only without the mortars. You're trying to toss these things up there. But once you do it, nobody suspects this. So overnight, year again is 1759, overnight, these guys crawl up to the surface, almost 1,000 feet above the seaway. You're climbing up and you get to the top and nobody knows you're there. The French army's up there, but they don't know you're there. It's dark. Wolfe leads his forces over into the plains of Abraham. The next morning, as the sun comes up, he leads a charge against the French. The French are overwhelmed. They lose a very, very tightly fought battle. Ultimately, General Wolfe is killed in the battle. General Montcalm, the French general, is captured. He surrenders and is captured. Quebec falls. It's a major, major, major British victory. Has anybody been to Quebec and you've seen that statue? That statue of General Wolfe? The British put it up?
Yeah, it was like 15 years ago.
Okay. Well, you can't forget it, because if you're a Canadian, you go, get that statue out of here. Especially if you're French Canadian. You go, ah, you! The British are here. They just, they can't leave it alone. We're going to put a statue. And it's very, very heroic. It looks like Jesus dying in the arms of the Virgin Mary. This is General Wolfe. Okay, fine. It's heroic. What I love about British statuary in the 18th century, it's absolutely heroic. It's all heroic stuff. And they want you to remember it. Okay. They then move on to Montreal. They take Montreal, defeat another French force. French are forced to surrender all of French Canada, all of it, including, here we go again, Louisbourg. So once again, because the Americans are involved again with the Louisbourg capture, they have a say in what's going to happen at the end of the treaty. In India, things are reversed when a young East India Company clerk in 1759 takes charge of a civilian militia and a number of Indian allies, just a small figure of about 500. But he's able to defeat a French army at the Battle of Plassey, P-L-A-S-S-Y, Battle of Plassey. The name of this young man is Robert Clive. Robert Clive, known in his C-L-I-V-E, known in history as Clive of India. Has anybody ever heard of that? Clive of India. God, you're taking English. Never heard of Clive of India? Okay. Nobody else has either. I mean, the British Empire is long over, so nobody knows and nobody cares. Well, I'm here to bring it back in all its glory. And I'm doing a very wonderful job of this morning. And then Clive turns his attention to Calcutta, which is the major French stronghold. There, one of the French allies named Suraj, S-U-R-A-J, Suraj Khan, captured several hundred English subjects near Calcutta, put them into a prison cell, which later becomes known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Have you ever heard of that? Where in the hell have you been? The Black Hole of Calcutta becomes a major outrage in England at the time. It spreads to everybody's heard about the Black Hole of Calcutta. And it becomes a battle cry for British revenge in India. Clive is able to take some 3,000 of his troops and his allies and inflict a major defeat on French-led Indian forces. So this war goes on. What we're looking at here is the globalization of the feuds between France and England. It's now globalized. battles take place in the Caribbean. And one of the things that is most effective is the revival of the British Navy that is able to control the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean. It's able to jump anywhere and everywhere with superior forces and typically just blockade the French at all four. The other thing, the successful thing that makes Britain successful is that they are able to, without domination, informally find ways of controlling the forces of the various states in India, as well as the number of Indian allies, Native American allies, operating in the Eastern Seaboard, to bring them into alliance with the British, and to do this on the cheap without dominating them. So they're able to effectively, what I would call, wrestle with this idea of, instead of subjugate and dominate, they will come in to impact, influence, very informally, or sometimes with the use of a lot of money to do it, to help bring about control of these groups to fight on their side. It seems to be the key to the growth of later the British Empire, is this particular kind of domination. When this conflict finally ends in 1763, Britain does the unthinkable. It keeps all of the territory it gained. All of it. Finally decides to keep Louisville. It's going to keep Quebec, Montreal, the St. Lawrence Seaway, all of the east coast of Canada. It's going to keep all the Caribbean possessions. What else had they seized? They had seized Manila and the Philippines from the Spanish during that war. They had seized Havana, again from Spain, during that war. A number of Spanish Hill Islands in the Caribbean are seized, so the Spanish get screwed again because they're tied to the French during this war. So the growth is really incredible. It's already the largest overseas empire by anybody's standards. And this is known as the First British Empire. They have under their possession as well the 13 American colonies. Now, one thing that they don't have in their possession, it won't show up yet, would be Australia and New Zealand. That's going to come into the collection process at the very end of the 18th century. About 1800 for one and 1840 for the other. Australia first and then New Zealand. That's not part of this. Also, Singapore is not part of this. Hong Kong is not part of this empire yet. That's all going to come in the early 19th century. Okay, so the treaty negotiations, they keep everything. What does that do? Well, it outrages the Europeans who said, wait a minute, that's not fair. You're supposed to give back certain things. Can't keep all that. Yes, we can, because we want it, and it's the third damn time we have won it, and we're not going to give it back this time. So they're gonna really create, because a violation of what I would call the traditional diplomatic solutions to these wars. Britain violates that standard by keeping everything. They're gonna make lasting enemies. Enemies for almost the immediate future. Every one of the countries involved in this war, which includes not just France and Spain, but Holland, that is the Dutch Republic, several of the Scandinavian countries, known as the League of Armed Neutrality. They're all going to be resenting the fact that the British have kept everything, because they're all losing something here. The British don't care. But this war has cost them a lot. And their battle cry is, we have won this fair and square. We have spent millions on this war. Something has to pay for it. And one of the areas that we defended with the highest cost of casualties was in fact the 13 colonies. Now, in the 13 colonies, you had a number of Americans, part of the British Empire, part of the British collective. They also fought in this war in terms of some are colonial militia, some are actually in the British Army itself, but you probably had close to 75 to 100,000 Americans fighting in the 7 Years' War. And the Americans fought in this war for one particular reason. It's the Americans' favorite thing in America. What is it that every American thinks is his inalienable right to have?
Property.
Property. We have been real estaters from the beginning. Brokers, realtors, or thieves, but with something. Well, we fought the war. Remember how this war got started originally? George Washington out there with a little surveyor, 10 guys, marching out of Virginia into the Ohio Valley, claiming Fort Washington area in western Pennsylvania. That is the American claim. We are claiming territory all the way to the Pacific.
He was also the first to order firing on French troops, correct?
Debatable. The French fired at him first. That's what he said. They shot at me first. You never got to remember, George never told a lie. So anyway, he probably did shoot first, but the Americans are told, well, no, wait a minute, not so fast. Because we're going to place some, the British told the Americans, we're going to put some 10,000 troops on the line between the official termination of the colony territory all the way across and through the Allegheny and Appalachian Range. It's called the approximation line of 1763. Troops for what? Troops to keep the Americans out of the Western territories. Why would we want to do that? Because we had Indian allies that fought in all these wars, including the 5 nations of the Iroquois. We owed them something, and we promised to keep the American colonists out of Indian territory. There's already a lot of fighting going on. The Americans have virtually no respect for the Native Americans. We want to take their territory, want to take their land. After all, didn't God give that to us? It's the beginnings of the idea of manifest destiny. You ever heard of it? It starts in the 18th century after the 7 Years' War. We think this is ours. We're sure it's ours. Ask anybody. Okay, I mean, we know how those beliefs have changed a bit today, but nonetheless, there's a lot of sentiment to that effect today still. But at the same time, British say no, you can't have that. We owe this to protect the Native Americans, and you need to stay out of here. The Americans said, wait a minute, we just fought 9 years of warfare to defend those rights to expand into this territory. Did we not? We lost thousands of guys in several wars along with you supporting your cause, and you're telling us we can't have our just dues? So our philosophy for fighting the war and the British philosophy at the end of the war were completely at odds. To add insult to injury, the British government complained they really didn't have the money to keep those troops along the approximation line. Therefore, who's going to pay for it? We are. That was bad. That was probably the dumbest move they made. Told us, no, you're going to pay for the troops. They're going to keep you out of the West. Say what? Are you fucking kidding me? You're going to keep us out and make us pay to keep ourselves out? Is that a deal or what? Who's running the show? Who? King who? King George said what? Can he speak English? Well, yeah, he does. This one does. And he's just, you know, he's making a move here. Yeah, and you're gonna do what I tell you, because I'm the king.
I mean, where was the approximation line?
Right along the eastern seaboard, just about 500 miles inland, along the Appalachian Allegheny Mountain Range. So we were determined we were going to move into that territory. We were also determined we were not going to pay that tax. And the British government was determined that they were going to keep us out of that territory and that we were going to pay that tax. And this is what leads to the American Revolution. And the primary reason is the British had never dictated to us much of any kind of policy in all the years that we had been around. We've been around 150 years. That's why it had grown to 3 million subjects at that time. The British Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder, told the British government, told the king, this is a stupid policy. This is going to get us nowhere. And a lot of Englishmen felt the same way. This was not the way to handle this situation, and especially the arrogance of slapping a tax on us to keep us out. So you have a real divide in England itself on the wisdom of this policy. But exactly at this same point, beginning about 1770, beginning 1763, the British issue the first direct tax on the first ever direct tax on the American colonies, called the stamp tax. Stamp tax is number one. Everything you buy is official document, wedding certificates, wills after the death of someone, personal property purchases, whatever it can be that's a legal document has a stamp on it, and that stamp is an official stamp with a tax built into it. And it is a direct tax on the colonies. The colonists said, wait a minute, you can't do this because you've never taxed us a direct tax, ever. All the taxes have been levied by the colonial government themselves. That is through the colonial parliaments or through the colonial governors, whether they're elected governors or royally appointed governors. No colony ever accepted a direct tax from Britain. They've always elected to tax themselves, and some of that would go to Britain. But this was not a choice. This is a direct tax. Well, the result was major riots throughout American cities at the time, especially Boston, Charleston, New York. They burned a lot of the tax rolls. They burned anybody who was trying to sell these things. So you attack the source of it directly. British government pulls back and they say, okay, we won't do it. They then return with another set of taxes called the coercive taxes. There's a whole slew of taxes that go into this. You're going to have at least 5 attempts to tax directly. The last being the attempt to tax tea coming into America. But the tea was priced so low that everybody thought the tax would not be even seen. That occurs in 1773 and 74. The British have given up on all the other taxes, but they never gave up the principle that they had the right to taxes. That's the issue. They believed they had the right to taxes. We believe they did not have the right for a direct taxation of any kind. British public is divided on this issue. William Pitt the Elder is absolutely determined that the British government's wrong, that George III is an idiot, that he shouldn't be doing it. So you have these big splits in the British political system at the time. What they saw as persecution of their American cousins would do nothing but inflame passions and possibly bring about a break with America, which was the dumbest idea of all. But the government would absolutely refuse to back off on the issue we can tax whenever we want. We may not be taxing you now, but we have the right to do it if we want to. Finally, you had a huge glut of tea left over from 1772 and 73. East India Company tea, purchased by the East India Company, but they had over-purchased. And therefore, they set a very, very low price on this tea. They had a glut of tea, nowhere to go with it. So what if you just cut the price way down? You sell it to the American colonies, but you put that little tax on it. But it's so low, nobody's going to know it's there, because this tea is already functioning at half price. So we're going to throw a little, what, 5% on there, it's going to be the tea tax. But nobody will ever notice it. And nobody's going to complain, because if you try to purchase tea from the Dutch, tea from the Spanish or the Portuguese or anybody else, it's going to cost you a fortune compared to what we are going to sell it for. So they tried one last time with the tea tax. And the Americans discovered how they did it, I'm not sure, but they discovered that there was indeed a tax on the tea. And rather than simply say, oh, let's just drink the damn tea, we're getting it for half price anyway, they decided to make a public gesture out of it, both in Boston and in Charleston, South Carolina, Boston, Massachusetts. You had raids on the British ships that brought in the tea. Boston Tea Party is no secret. Everybody knows what happened with that one. Guys disguised as Indians, but not too well apparently. Threw the huge tea chest into Massachusetts Bay. These are huge chests of tea, very ornate, covered with mother of pearl. The chest itself is worth more than the tea by far. They sunk hundreds of them through over deck. Hundreds of them. There are probably still a lot of them down at the bottom of Boston, at Boston Bay. But it's in Charleston where they really got riled up. Southerners finally woke up down there and said, damn, this hell is tax tea? Well, so let's do something about it. They burned the ships. So they set the British merchant fleet on fire at Charleston. They only sank the tea chests at Boston. But this thing began to spread up and down the East Coast. And ultimately, you have a new prime minister working for George III, who has come to power. His name is Lord North. Lord North. How many have heard of Lord North? Anybody that studied American history knows about Lord North. He is the Antichrist in American Revolutionary parlance. Lord North decided to send troops to Boston to punish those bad little Bostonians, to be housed and quartered and paid for by Americans. And they're to shut down Boston Harbor. And you will enjoy it. And you will do it at your own expense. Now, what I'm saying here, the British are showing absolutely no compromise, and they're showing absolutely no wisdom in how they're handling this thing at all. They're making it worse. Lord North is determined to crush them. They're yelling taxation without representation, the same battle cry as before. They're anti-Lord North. Lord North has replaced the Prime Minister, the other Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder. Pitt died. Pitt was old. He died. But he died a man who was supported by most of the people of Britain who said, this is wrong. Along comes Lord North. Lord North takes just the opposite point of view and decides to sock it to the Americans. Yes.
Does George appoint him or Parliament?
George likes him. George makes the decision who his ministers are. Because George thinks he can rule as well as reign. So he's going to do it. And Parliament's going to support this. You have a Parliament now is really taking the tough approach toward the American colonies. They feel like they've been insulted long enough. What I think probably is the big rub here is that for 170 years, from 1607 up to 1775, you've never had direct tax. You've never had the enforcement of a mercantile system on the American colonies. You never tried to enforce British laws in the Americas, ever. We were the product of what is sometimes called benign neglect. Meaning, we were allowed to grow like topsy, with not much help from Britain at all. Colonials simply came and they learned how to survive on their own. They learned how to grow tobacco in the South, sell it back to the British. Made some money that way. They began to grow other products, and they began to farm, and they began to do a lot of things which gave them money from the land. What they never did do was discover gold or anything else that gave them any easy money. It all had to be done through agriculture or through trapping, trading, and so forth. No home manufacturing was allowed, although they did a lot of it. But it couldn't be done industrially. It had to be done vis-a-vis like cottage industry. You could make and build your own rifles if you wanted to. But basically, if the British found out about it, they would take the rifle from you, and they would sell you one. That's because this is part of the mercantile system. We take the raw resources and we send it back to you. But basically, the Americans grew on their own. And that's why there's so many non-English living in the American colonies up to 1755, 56. What are we talking? You've got French living in the Americas now. You've got Dutch living there. Portuguese, Spanish. You've got a large contingent of Jews that lived there that came from God knows where. We don't even know where they came from. They found their way to America, all in the 1st century. They came there, they cultivated, they developed. They had separate, very different interests, and they floated throughout the 13th. They would make up different religious concepts. We have Protestants and Catholics and all kinds of Protestants. Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, Calvinists of all kinds, Eastern Orthodox. They're all here. They came from all over. You look at the French growth in French Canada, only French can be part of it. That's why they only had 50,000 French settlers in French Canada, and that's why they lost Canada. The same thing is true with the Latin American colonies, sponsored by Spain. Spanish would only allow people from Spain or under Spanish domination to go into the Spanish colonies. It's called the asiento, meaning the assent has been granted for you and your people to go into any part of Latin America. Same with the Portuguese in Brazil. You had a policy of asiento. Only colonists who are Portuguese can go to Brazil. Spain, only colonists that are Spanish can go into Latin America. But the Americans and the English policy was one of what? Let it happen. Let anything happen. We don't care. Just go in. As long as you're willing to go in and work and settle, you can do it. That's why the ethos of this country starts differently. It has a different set of values. It's not protected. This is not protected immigration. This is open immigration for anybody that will come and do the work.
And we actually had free immigration until 1914.
Pretty much. It's the Irish that screwed it up. When all the cops became Irish, we said, oh, what have we done? All the fire departments were Irish. They wouldn't put out your fire if you were No, it's a very different take of things. Ultimately, what happens in April of 1875, a year before the war, is that the billeting meaning housing of English troops in Boston at the expense of the Boston population. You take them in to feed them, to house them, and all that, creates huge amounts of resentment that just needed not be. They call these British troops, because they had the red uniforms, the lobster backs. And they sort of, if you look at the costumes of the time, they sort of look like that. But what these guys begin to do to really cause trouble had nothing to do with the Tea Party or anything else. It had to do with these English sailors on board ship, or English Marines on board ship, all who are trained to do certain things back at home, They might have been shipbuilders, they might have been welders, they might have been wheelwrights, they could have been bakers. They all now are in Boston, and they're looking for work. That means you've got a skilled laborer coming from England. He's a soldier, he's a recruit, but he's also skilled labor. He's going to look for a job in a bakery shop. He's going to look for a job in a rope company that builds masts for ships and ropes and gears, everything else. He's going to look for a job in a blacksmith shop. He's skilled. He's going to get hired. All these guys are going to get hired, and what's going to happen? They're going to put the Native Americans out of work because we have skills, but we don't have skills to that degree. We're not that advanced in terms of the technology that was all available in England, but not available here. So it becomes a labor problem in 1775 that never existed before. So the Americans really get hot under the collar. They attack these guys, go on strike, you're scabbed and you're attacked, and suddenly it becomes something else altogether.
So you're not meeting the Native Americans, you're meeting the settlers.
I mean American settlers. Okay, yeah, that's right. Listen, I said that. I'm not referring to the Indians. Bad white people. Come on, you gotta be politically correct. If you're white, you're bad. Snap out of it. As soon as you know it, the better off you're gonna be. All right, be a fool. So, I'm so sorry. So here we go with this resentment, and suddenly, you've got major riots on your hands. You already had an incident a couple years earlier that raised all kinds of ire, and that was the Boston Massacre, where a number of Americans attacked British soldiers. We hit them with snowballs full of ice and rocks and glass and everything else. The British fired back and killed about 7 guys. 73. That was the beginning of real hostilities. And then you had propaganda sheets come out like the Sons of Liberty, committees of correspondence. These are organizations set up to propagandize a revolution against the British. Throw the British out. We don't need the British. And then we had in circulation by 1775 a letter put out by a former Brit who now lived in the colonies, named Thomas Paine, P-A-Y-N-E, a real pain in the neck for the British. He wrote a treatise called Common Sense, very famous, in which he talked about what right do the weak, effeminate British, his words, have to rule the tough outdoor Americans who have fought to develop this country and this frontier and so on. And he just paints a picture of all these English looking like, you know, wallflowers at a dance, all with their powdered wigs and their perfume and all the bullshit. And over here, these Americans dressed in coonskin and out there with their big guns and they're fighting to clear the wilderness. What right do these wimps have to rule these guys? That thing probably did more than anything. That's a bit of propaganda that spread like crazy. It just changed the attitude. When the split came in the American colonies and said, God, enough of this, you still had no clear winner in terms of public opinion. Basically, public opinion was divided 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 saying, let's split with the British. Sooner the better. Another opinion saying, 1/3 opinion, basically, let's not split with the mother country, let's give this a chance. We don't want to do it. We don't want to leave England. We don't want to leave the mother country. It's a drastic move. Ridiculous. Another third, no opinion at all. And what common sense does is affects this 1/3 that had no particular opinion, and impacted them to start believing in revolution. So you have basically an ideological switch in the year 1775 and early 76 to turn the population in support of a major war for independence against the British. It didn't happen overnight. This thing wasn't exactly planned. And in April of 1775, as all this is coming to a head, both in Boston, Charleston, the committees of correspondence, aggravated by the Sons of Liberty who are trying to spread this, and then you have the spread of this great tract, common sense, suddenly everything explodes. And you have a British regiment heading from Boston to the suburb of Lexington, April 5th, 1775, and its destination is to go all the way past Lexington to Concord and to disarm the arsenal, the weapons depot at Concord. Take all the weapons, take all the gunpowder, all of it, so the colonial militia could not use it. Now, the colonial militia is the group that, of course, had access to this in case of war, another war with France or Indian attacks. This was typical throughout the colonies. You have this. So this is an attack on the American militia system, which the British had originally set up so that we could remain independent, keep independent, and so forth. So the British would not have to step in and do anything. Now the British want to disarm us. General Gage sends troops, about 1,500 troops. It's about a 20-mile trek to Lexington and Concord. And that's where you have Paul Revere and the whole message set up. The British are coming, the British are coming. He's a well-respected silversmith. People believe him. Flashes the lights, one by sea, two by land. The British are coming by land. At Lexington Green, they're waiting. There are maybe 200 militiamen at Lexington Green. These are guys that have never fired a shot in anger. They're old farts like me. They hobble out, they get their musket. If they can even get the damn thing loaded, they're lucky. Just for encouragement, they take a couple of swigs of white lightning. They made it themselves. And they're ready to tackle the world. And they probably have an Irishman or two in the group. Ready to tackle whatever else. And the British arrive. And they reenact this every year in Lexington. Today, I mean, I went there a couple years back, and I remember going, it's called Patriots Day. And you go to, I think it's, April the 5th, Patriots Day, and these guys are running around with these Revolutionary War outfits and hats on and guns and stuff, and they're reenacting the whole thing, where so-and-so stood. It's just hysterical. It's all Vietnam. They don't know who these people were. It's 250 or 30. Who the hell knows? So anyway, but it's a great time. And there's always a pub nearby afterwards. So enjoy it. They reenact this, but they're telling you that, here and here and here, these guys stood up, someone fired a shot, and suddenly you have 20 guys laying on the green, dead or badly wounded, and these are the American militiamen. They fired a few shots back and then just simply got the hell out. They're facing 1,500 guys. There's only 200 of them. So now they move on to Concord, where they're going to disarm the arsenal. You get to Concord, they disarm the arsenal, they then burn it down. They come back across Concord Bridge, there's been no opposition there, and suddenly somebody starts shooting at them. They don't see who's shooting at them, because those damn Americans are playing by the wrong rules. They're hiding behind rocks, bastards. They're hiding behind trees. You can't shoot them when you're like that. And then they get past Lexington. Most of the army intact, but watching the sides of the roads, and they get to an area that today is known as Arlington. Has anybody been back there? Arlington is an area between Lexington and Boston, but in those days it was called Menominee. It's a Native American name, Menominee. You've got maybe just about a mile of the little town of Menominee. They're going through there, and you've got hedgerows on both sides. And that's when the American militia got to them and picked off about 500 guys. The British finally got back to Boston, very badly wounded, many of them dead. They reported they had been ambushed at Menominee, doing their job. The fact is, the Americans got even for what happened at Lexington. And that's the way they looked at it. The shots that are fired, that are heard round the world, as they love to say, these are the shots that are fired that are around the world, were fired a year before we were actually in the war. In other words, there was no declaration of independence. Nothing until the following year from now, July the 4th. So this action in the war begins a full year prior to this. And then the American militia head for the high points above the city of Boston. What's hanging? You've got two hills up there, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. So what the Americans did was run to Lewisburg with ships, disarm Lewisburg of all its artillery, and bring it down, not to Bunker Hill, but to Breed's Hill. Aim it on the city of Boston, where the British are now stationed, and began the process of open fire against the British in Boston. The British have no recourse but to get the hell out of Boston. So they're going to retreat. This war is going full blood long before it's declared. Ultimately, you have the First Continental Congress. They gather very briefly, and they decide to do something about the fighting and everything else. Many of them said, "Look, this war is suicidal." So they send the Olive Branch Petition to Britain. Olive Branch means the branch of peace. Olive Branch Petition goes to King George III. The Americans had this very naive idea that King George did not know what was going on in the colonies. That if he knew that his ministers were running rampant, like Lord North and so forth, running rampant over the colonies here, abusing the privilege, that we had absolutely no rights, we had no vote, we had nothing, that if George knew what was going on, he would do something about it. This is the Olive Branch Petition written directly to George III. What has to be understood is a very naive American political public. I mean, if you don't know who you're dealing with in terms of writing letters and assuming that they are operating in good faith, that can become a real problem when you find out that you've been terribly wrong, terribly mistaken. I always like to think I have operating in good faith when I deal with somebody in administration, until I find out they have absolutely no intent of ever even looking at what you're saying, and then something changes. And when that happens, it's just not the same again. You lose faith in the system, you lose faith in the persona, and it changes everything. It changes everything. It's called a vote of no confidence that takes place when you go, okay, this is the way you're going to go. And I just experienced one of these things just recently. And I get really pissed about these things. Because even though I see it, I mean, we see this kind of stuff, we talk about it in classroom, but when it really happens, I'm like, get your ass, motherfucker. This is like pardon me. Sorry. You know I'm really not. Sorry, guys. Now, the olive branch petition is ultimately received by George III. A year goes by, Boston's evacuated by the British. The British have evacuated a lot of the American colonies, but they're now sending a military force, another military, back in force to retake all the colonies, including and especially New York and Boston. Charleston too. It's a major force of over 20,000 that's coming, at least that.
What's that,
1776 now, they're coming back. They're coming back in force. They now have the world's greatest navy. Again, they have a large army, bigger than they've had before, and they have brought with them mercenary troops hired from the German state of Hesse, H-E-S-S-E. They're known as the Hessians. The whole group is now coming back bigger than ever to punish the colonials, to bring them to their knees. When King George reads the Olive Branch petition, he says one thing. How can you say you are loyal subjects of the crown when you are already killing the soldiers and defenders of the crown? Meaning, what happened at Lexington and Concord and in Boston. You are not loyal subjects of anybody. We couldn't argue with that point. But by the same token, you know, who started the shooting? Who started the occupation? So it's no longer, it's an issue that's in George's mind is already out of control. You're already showing yourself to be disloyal little bastards. I'll get your question in a second. And so, in this, basically, we have the Second Continental Congress meeting in Virginia. They take up what is unbelievable, the Declaration of Independence. It has gotten so far, George has rejected our olive branch, and now we, based on natural law, reject George. George has failed to fulfill his contract under natural law in 23 separate ways. So based on John Locke's principle, going back to 1688, under natural law, the American revolutionaries, the leaders of the Declaration of Independence, said, you have violated your contract. Therefore, we're going to fire you and hire somebody else. Just like that. But we wrote this down to proclaim to the world we're doing it justified on natural law. This is not just a riot in the street corner. This is not just discontent. This is a major flaw. It's a major violation of that which we all believe. And of course, all people do not believe that. The Europeans never heard of natural law. They didn't believe it. Or didn't know what it was.